You have it. It was really nice. I actually ran into Yvonne shopping Saturday and she mentioned she was traveling. And I was like, oh my gosh, we haven't really talked about attendance. It just hadn't come up with onboarding. So hence my Sunday email just being like, oh gosh, we're 6, not 7. And that means we kind of need a head count. So just thank you all.
Yvonne, you can talk if you'd like.
So the 7th is gonna come in August, is that?
Correct. So council.
Can you hear me? Oh, yay, there I am. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just
Oh,
wondering
you're
if
fine.
my
Thank you
voice
so
was
much.
working. Okay,
Thank you so much for joining from DC.
of course. Thank you.
There were a few boards that were not fully seated in March when they seated the others, and so the Board and Commissions Committee had calendared it for August. I kind of begged that since we're gonna be using our existing applicants, could we take 5 minutes at a meeting and get our 7th member?
Yeah.
They said no. So they'll do it with everything else in August, which is only a few meetings away.
So will we have, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah, maybe under matters from the board. We have
Just-
any public-
Quick question, being remote, am I supposed to be on camera? I don't know what you see on your end. I don't think I'm on camera.
Yvonne, I'll share with you what the handbook says. There's no rule. What previous PRABs had decided and what is codified in the handbook is that there is a preference if you're virtual that you have your camera on, both for the board to read facial expressions and see when you want to talk, but also for the community to know that you're there and participating. It's not a rule, it's a preference the previous board had codified in the handbook. And so I would defer to you all what you think is best.
I'm happy to do either. I just can't figure out, it says I'm on a Zoom, but I don't see any option to show myself. Usually on a Zoom call, you can, hit camera. Oh, wait, maybe some.
Except the panelist.
Oh, now I see. Okay, thank you, whoever sent that to me, and now I can start. There you go.
So Yvonne is
everybody.
in Washington DC and on East Coast time, and just appreciate you joining while traveling. I know we appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
All right, it's 6 o'clock. We have a quorum. So have we started recording?
Yes.
Great. All right, so would anybody like to make I will officially call the meeting to order. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the agenda?
I move.
Second, and is there a second?
Second.
All right, is there any discussion for the motion to approve the agenda or any comments on the agenda? All right. So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Nobody against the motion? Okay, hearing no opposition, the motion passes and the agenda is approved. I will now turn it over to the director for future board items.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Folks, I'm Allie Rhodes. I am the Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of Boulder. For the future items, last month we talked a lot through your calendar, through your CIP tour in August. So I want to focus tonight just on some exciting opportunities coming up to engage with the community. One this weekend, it has been shoulder season at Scott Carpenter Pool. This weekend, the swim beach at the Boulder Reservoir, the leisure pool at Scott Carpenter Pool opens, and then Spruce will follow shortly thereafter, I think June 10th, maybe? No, they're both opening. They're both opening this weekend. Check it all out. June 16th, we are doing a community open house to share the civic area concept plan, which is the amalgamation of all of the feedback we've heard from the community, the two draft concepts that were shown. And so there is a kid concert in the park. There is an open house. We'll repeat that July 14th and expect to get a whole lot of folks downtown talking to us about the civic area. There's also a series of nature play pop-ups happening in the civic area this summer. There's information online about all of that, but really our goal is to get a lot of people playing in the park and giving us input on that concept plan so that we can take that to help prioritize what gets funded for this next phase of construction. With that, I'll hand it back to you.
Right. Our next section is public participation. This portion of the meeting is for members of the public to communicate ideas or concerns to the board regarding parks and recreation issues for which a public hearing is not scheduled later in the meeting. Tonight, there are no public hearings scheduled, so all public participation will happen at this time. I believe that we have one person online for public participation. Is that correct? Correct. Okay. During this public participation time, the public is encouraged to comment on the need for parks and recreation programs and facilities as they perceive them. All speakers are limited to 3 minutes. Depending on the nature of your matter, you may or may not receive a response from the board after you deliver your comments. The board is always listening to and appreciative of community feedback. Clarissa, will you please present the additional guidelines if necessary, and then call in our first speaker tonight?
Yes. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and council, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit our website at the link shown. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. All right, Patrick, I'm going to set up the timer and then you'll be able to start speaking.
I'm good to go. Hello, Parks and Rec Board. I want to welcome the new members to the committee. My name is Patrick O'Rourke. I'm the Preservation Chair and the Vice President of Historic Boulder here in town. And I wanted to take this opportunity to put in a request. I sent an email to all the members this afternoon of what is called the HIP, the Historic Places Plan. I would hope that you take the opportunity to review it. And then what my request, or Historic Boulder's request, is to get an update from the Parks and Recreation Department and Board about what the current status of the 13 facilities that the Parks and Recreation Board is the steward of. We think they're doing a great job. Chautauqua, of the 10 historic districts, the Parks and Recreation Board is in charge of 3 of them, I understand. Chautauqua, the Columbia Cemetery, and the Pearl Street Mall. We're pretty much up to speed on what's eventually going to happen at the Pearl Street Mall. And we know the stewardess, the work done at Chautauqua is always sensitive and well done. As a matter of fact, the kids' park is incredible. So thank you for doing a great job there. Our concerns are in 2 areas. One is what happened to the HIP? The city spent over $200,000 having a report done, and it was finished in 2023. In that report, there were recommendations, and we just would like to find out what recommendations are being followed through on, specifically dealing with 3 or 4 properties. The Harbeck House, which is a treasure for the city of Boulder, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I'm not sure, and we would like to find out what's happening there. The Firehouse, which is used for the ceramics groups, is I think that's in pretty good shape, but it also needed some work. And then there's just a collection of other properties, and the Boyd Smelter, just a little bit of work there will solve the problems that exist. Finally, the comprehensive plan is being updated, and we believe that the HIP should be an important component of that update. Historic places in Boulder is important. I mean, we all know that one of the reasons why Sundance is coming to Boulder is because of our historic sites. So I want to thank you and welcome the new board members, and we're just requesting that sometime in the future, we get an update. Have a good day.
All right, thank you so much for your comments. Since there are no other public or no other community members who would like to speak tonight, I will close public comment. Is there anything that the staff or the board would like to respond to in regard to the public comment tonight? No? Okay. Great. I'll turn the page.
Jenny, while you do that, I'll just say that I would defer to the chair and vice chair if that were to be something you want to be calendared. We don't have an implementation report for the HIP, and so it would take some staff work to put something together. I don't see, when I look at your agenda, August is the capital meeting, the July meeting that you saw in future board items is fairly full, but would defer to the chair and vice chair to bring that back to a future meeting if you'd like an update on that.
All right, I will add that to discussion for the agenda setting meeting next week. Thank you, Helen. All right, moving on to the consent agenda. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes from our last meeting?
Move.
All right, second,
I can second.
are there any questions or discussion regarding the consent agenda?
Oh, I would love to, just because I'm curious, hear an update about the senior basketball issue from last meeting.
Oh, Megan Lohman, our senior manager for recreation, is here and can give an update.
Yeah, so the challenge, I will say, has been resolved. It was probably resolved 3 weeks before the meeting last time, to be honest. And it by choice of participants themselves have self-selected to participate or not in in senior basketball. So
was the member that was a bit aggressive, did they decide not to participate, or was it other members?
that person has decided to participate in a little bit more competitive option somewhere else. And they had done that before the meeting last time.
Wow, that sounds like a great solution.
All right, anything else on the consent agenda from anybody? I wanted to just ask briefly about the community forest court update. How many people, oh, I see 150 youth applied for the program and 20 were hired. What generally are the qualifications for people who are selected for the program?
Follow up with you on that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head.
That's just, that's a lot, that's a great number of applicants. That is
Yeah.
fantastic.
It's wonderful.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the program, like how long, I see how long it goes, but how many days a week? Is there a number of hours? No. Okay.
I'm sorry. I can get more details and get back to you.
I can add a little bit of context if it's helpful, just to know
Please.
that this year, the city is working with Boulder County and tag teaming off a lot of experience they have in drumming up this interest, right? And so that is partly to do with the great number of applicants and so on. And so they've worked with us and our forestry team to identify the priority locations where they can help. And it's just a beautiful synergy between some of the stuff that we design and install. And then the young people are then a part of maintaining those. For example, at Crestview Park is one place I'm thinking about.
But your specifics about how we're selecting people, their schedules, we have to follow up. We can include it in next month's consent.
It was
agenda.
just I have a friend whose son was chosen and they were so incredibly excited. So,
Yeah. We have enough work for programs like this to be larger. Funding is the limiting factor.
yes, of course. All right.
I know, I was also impressed with the number of applicants, and I think it shows that there's probably some like learnings there about successful outreach too. It seems like a lot of people heard about this program, and we're excited about it.
That's a really good point.
All right. No amendments. So we'll go ahead and we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor, raise your hand. Anybody nay? No? All right, then the consent agenda is approved. And we have minutes approved for the last meeting as well in there. All right. Then the motion passes and the minutes are approved. I'll now turn over to Ally Rhodes to discuss the Parks and Recreation updates in the consent agenda. Did we do that already?
I think you just did all
Okay,
that.
great.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, then action items. So
We have
do you
none.
have any
this
action
month.
items? No action items?
No action items.
Great. Thanks y'all for bearing with me on this.
You're good.
Official.
It's your second meeting, Madam Chair. You're doing fine.
So many pages.
We have several matters from the department tonight. And so you just heard from, I'll introduce Darren Wagner, Senior Landscape Architect. She's been the project manager on the Future of Recreation Centers project. And we have a draft needs assessment coming that you all are going to provide input on. Given that it wasn't ready yet, and given the interest for this board on this project, Darren has joined to give an overview of the project's process, purpose, and status, so that when we get to that needs assessment, the newer board members have had that chance to get up to speed on the background of the project. So that's the intent of tonight's item. Thanks for joining us, Darren.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me again, Darren Wagner. Thrilled to meet all of you. Appreciate the time tonight. Jenny, thank you, as I know you'll have heard some of this already before, but hopefully it's a good refresher. As Ally was saying, we do want to just make sure that you have that foundation of background and process and status. It's been a wonderful, deep, broad engagement process. And so part of our findings that we will highlight tonight let you in on kind of some of that analysis that's been done through the engagement process so far. That was also included in some past memos from to the PRAB earlier before some of you joined. And so after we go through an overview and those findings, then I'll give you an idea of next steps and what that will look like also. So for a little background, why we're even doing this project. I imagine to some extent it's obvious that we have 3 rec centers and that they function together, but in other ways, this process has been a way to let us step back and look at the ways they operate as a system and how they're serving our community, and in what ways. So for example, when we think about the North Boulder Rec Center, it gets the lion's share of our participation, our visitation. It also serves as a centralized location for gymnastics. That's not a recreation activity we provide elsewhere in other places. And it's also home to Boulder High's swim team. You compare that to South. South functions at smaller square footage currently, and it functions as a neighborhood anchor with a lot of community gathering and neighboring that happens there. And it's home to a competitor, Fairview's swim team. And then we have East, and that in and of itself is a unique location because we have co-located there with us the East Agewell Center for older adults. And so as we think about how the different amenities and offerings at these locations are serving our community, it helps just start with a baseline of like, what do they look like and what services are available. We also have been partnering really deeply with the facilities and fleet department. And so you will see in future meetings, some of our colleagues join us because it is their charge to actually manage the facility and the envelope and the maintenance. In 2021, their department plan had given grades or letter scores to the department, to each of the 3 locations, just in terms of its physical shape. How bad is it? Since this time, some work has been done on emergency repairs. And we've done an additional evaluation to confirm these findings. We haven't done a full regrading of the facilities, but it still gives you a picture that the worst really is south. But east isn't far behind. And in truth, we're really learning the details around that north isn't truly that far behind either, that from a portfolio standpoint, we have aging facilities, as do a lot of municipalities out there. So as we think about the future and how this project can support that, we are thrilled to have taxpayer funding through a previous round of the Community Culture Resilience and Safety Tax, and are working on scoping that and have used this project as an opportunity to understand what those improvements can and cannot include in that broader scheme of things. We've also, through, as I mentioned, additional analysis and also engagement with the community, been able to identify funding to support short-term repairs at South. So previous plans, both our own and the department plan from the Facilities and Fleet Department, both have identified that South is a candidate for replacement, that it was effectively past the end of its life cycle, but through these short-term repairs, we do hope to extend that life, hopefully at least another 5 years. And as we look into longer term funding strategies, we'll have conversations with the community about the extent to which we could fund a replacement facility beyond this initial timeframe. North, we are planning on similar short-term repairs next summer, to do the same thing, to extend operations and support that building into the future. And then expect to have similar conversations about the needs for future renovations there with the community in terms of funding opportunities and needs. Meanwhile, there's this conversation that's been a part of the community or been in the community for a number of decades around whether or not we need or is feasible a competitive aquatics facility. This project was not scoped as a feasibility study for that fourth facility. It was really meant to focus on how both funded and unfunded renovations to our existing buildings could serve the community and its needs both now and into the future. But what this study has done is it's helped kind of identify what are those leftover needs that we don't expect renovations can accommodate. And I'll go through those a little bit tonight, as well as the report when that comes out. We'll go into that in much more depth. So really at the essence of what this initial phase of work has meant to do, it's not the report when it comes out is not a decision-making document. It's not a plan. It's not a full commitment that you and City Council would need to accept. Rather, it's meant to inform two primary separate efforts. And one is, as I mentioned, the funded renovations to East, and you'll hear more about that as the summer goes on, as well as to inform these citywide conversations through the Fund Our Future project. Which is meant to try and identify and discuss and prioritize with community members of all of the unfunded needs out there from a capital standpoint, whether it's roads, public safety buildings, fire stations, recreation centers. How do our needs at these rec centers stack up to the others in relation to how willing the community is to fund those as part of potential future tax initiatives. So we're providing some inputs and information into these two separate efforts. So the inputs into our process, really threefold, and this is how we approach all of our projects. And so if you've read and become familiar with our department plan, you'll see a version of this graphic in there and probably in all of our future our future work, because we're of course guided by existing policies in place. And in this case, there's a whole host of them, but one highlight would be the city's sustainability, equity, and resilience framework, which really guides how we move towards a desired future state in regards to all of those three things. And it has a lot to do with some of the energy upgrades that we need to make at our facilities to sustain the buildings, to reduce our carbon portfolio and move forward on a number of pieces. From the data and research side, this effort has involves a whole host of experts. We have consultants on board from Perkins and Will, and they're an international firm that has done rec centers across North America and across the world. In fact, have done a lot of zero energy work in that space, which is pretty impressive. So they've helped us identify recreation demand and what that might look like into the future, and how our levels of service compare to a set of peer agencies that we've surveyed and engaged with. And then again, done this updated building evaluation to understand the physical conditions that we need to keep in mind as we think about the future of these centers. And so all of these things together with community engagement are what will come together into the development of these needs and opportunities in the report. And it's really a synthesis of all of these things as we move that forward. So if you've been to the rec centers lately, you might hopefully have seen this graphic. We have these vinyls up at all 3 centers and have for some time. They are meant to lay out the process of what this first phase is looking like and how it will inform future efforts. Just because it's a small graphic, and I have another version of it here in terms of the engagement windows that are part of this process. We started as far back as 2023 with some early listening at all of the 3 centers, and that helped us distill and confirm a set of community values that are important to community members in relation to how the rec centers serve the community, as well as what are their hopes and fears for the future. And then in fall of 24, we moved that conversation forward and trying to understand what is it that people want to do at our centers. You know, it's if you look around at what other communities are doing, there are all kinds of things happening at community rec centers across the country. And so we wanted to know what are the most important things that city rec centers should provide, especially as we think about ourselves in a mix of the YMCA and private gyms and home gyms and commercial gyms and so on. And then more specifically then of those priority activities, how do we identify how we might solve them at each of the centers? It's a puzzle because we don't need everything everywhere, and nor can we afford it. In early April, we went and had a quick sort of open office hours session. Jody, thank you for attending. And that was an opportunity to understand or to let the community in on our status, which was that we are working on developing these preliminary recommendations, both at the system-wide scale, but then also developing a set of preliminary design concepts for the renovation at East. And so kind of midway through that process, we just wanted to open the doors and see if community had questions on the process. And we had about 100 people attend, which was great. And so this is all gearing up for the summer where we will share the final report and a set of preliminary design options for the renovations at East. And so what I wanted to do tonight, again, some of this work has been summarized in past memos, but sometimes it's nice to just sort of hear it explained, and then happy to answer any questions, is to just highlight some of the feedback from this engagement that we've heard. We have guidance from decades of our department plan, where we have a set of priority populations that we as providers of public recreation centers are obligated to engage and support and serve. And so we made an effort through what we call micro engagements to go out and talk to these different groups. And the feedback that we heard in these various locations was it confirmed a lot of themes that we've heard over the years, and some new things as well. Teens are interested in teen rooms. Sometimes I find myself, no matter how much I work with youth, I find myself surprised when they want something analog, in person, but that's actually really what they're looking for, is community gathering and even food service at our rec centers and ways to support gathering and classes and other things. Our older adults are really interested in seeing opportunities for warm water wellness expanded across the system. And the idea of indoor jogging and walking came up as something that we don't currently provide, but there was a lot of interest from not just older adults, but from a number of cross sections of the community. People with disabilities, really swimming is an important activity to them, as is community gathering. We met with community connectors, who are individuals that help us reach deeply into traditionally marginalized communities. And some really creative ideas emerged from there in relation to ways that rec centers could support kind of a family experience in ways that we're not currently, whether it's monitored indoor play areas instead of a room where you just kind of shut your kid away while you're working out somewhere else. How do we engage them in more playful ways and connect with nature through indoor outdoor spaces at the same time? So we took this feedback into a much bigger engagement with 50 invitees from all different cross sections of the community. This was in January of this year, and asked this diverse set of participants to engage in prioritizing those activities and amenities at each of the centers in ways that you had to kind of do some horse trading and work on understanding the perspectives and needs of other demographics or experiences or participants. And we, through that evening, engaged a graphic artist, graphic recorder, who captured some of the major themes that emerged from that evening. And that is the graphic that you're seeing here. And this was replicated and put in each of the centers for a couple of weeks also. And community members were invited to identify which of these activities they most resonate with and put a dot next to those things, help us understand if there's anything missing. And excuse me, throughout all of these engagements and engagement windows, it helped us distill and understand sort of how, again, the community sees our rec centers in the mix of indoor recreation across the city. And not surprisingly, the bread and butter is the fitness piece. And this desire to see some of our strength and cardio areas expanded. We have places, if you know, haven't been recently, like at North or at East, where things are exceptionally crowded, even South also. And gyms, lots of interest in expanding and enhancing those as well. Aquatics, also not surprising, really, we have a strong swimming community here in Boulder. And that emerged as a top priority for us to continue exploring, whether it's adding lap lanes at an individual center and or exploring partnerships for that potential fourth facility or something like it. And I'll go through these others quickly. Again, this information is in past packets, but mindfulness and wellness also showed up really strongly. Indoor racket sports did as well. And of course, we do to some extent provide multi-purpose spaces in our gymnasiums for indoor racket sports. And the possibility of future dedicated indoor court spaces certainly came up here, although it wasn't the focus of this report, as it's something beyond what our rec centers can fully accommodate on their own. And then again, this sort of idea or this value around lifelong wellness continued to show up strongly, whether it's in here, supporting children and youth activities, but also all the way through older adult recreation as well. In addition, so those things I just summarized are things that the community consistently said, no matter what center we're talking about. There are additional priorities that emerged for each of these centers that the community is interested in advancing into future projects or conversations. Warm water is a priority at East, and especially in relation to the co-location of the East Agewell Center, that has a lot of value in that location. And a lot of interest in seeing whether that indoor track is feasible at East, making connections with nature stronger and more overt, expanding fitness classrooms. The South community confirmed that, you know, in their ideal state, that the replacement facility, if it were funded, would still have those core amenities that any rec center typically does. But in addition to that, you know, there was a lot of interest in the possibility of having indoor field sports available at that location also, through the potential of a field house, which might be an extension or an addition onto a potential replacement facility beyond that kind of core rec center function. At North, there was a lot of like, we love North. It's just crowded and busy. Is there any way we can just have more, but also more programs, but also more spaces to do them in. And obviously parking is an issue and so on, but you know, that's another location where maybe an indoor track might be a possibility in a constrained environment, but we're just not sure yet. These are ideas that emerged from the community, and what our job is now, what we're working through right now, both for design options at East, as well as we think about all of the needs that are kind of converging, is how do we align these community priorities or desires with realities in relation, for example, to these three pillars, which are guidance for our facilities and fleet department, and in their department plan, where they talk about that a building is not just a building, that it serves multiple purposes, and one of those is around environmental sustainability. And in order to advance citywide climate goals, these rec centers need to have significant energy upgrades to reduce energy waste and consumption. And energy codes have, among many other types of codes, really expanded over the years. And so our facilities are not meeting current codes in a number of different ways. And so how do we lay those kind of basic functions next to the recreational amenities and integrate those in a way that the budget can accommodate it? And that financial stewardship piece is something that, you know, obviously we have a confined budget for the design of East. And so how do we fit all these things into just that? And then what leftover needs does that are still remaining that we might need to consider in a future work in both North and South Boulder? And so again, as we're pulling this report together, we're going to really be shifting emphasis, and the conversations will change. And so once we have this report together and we close that phase of work out, then really it shifts to, okay, what will that budget at East help us accommodate? What are the preliminary design options and then the preferred design option that we want to move forward with? And beyond East, then that's where this citywide team that's managing a project called Fund Our Future will really pick up and facilitate a set of conversations with the community, again, around how our needs stack up against all the other citywide needs and how those may or may not be accommodated in future tax initiatives to find that funding. And so just to wrap us up in terms of where we're headed next, there is a community council forum on June 12th that this other citywide team is facilitating. This is a somewhat new forum for the city, and the communications and engagement staff are piloting this. And it's a creative way of trying to engage diverse interests. And so they this week are going to be releasing a press release with more information about what this forum will look like. So stay tuned on that. And then we'll look in the summer to do several things. I had mentioned this next engagement window will be an option to look opportunity to look at the potential designs at East and weigh in. We'll release that final report for the needs assessment and close that project out. And then we will be getting down and dirty at South, and there will be some closures there, and we'll be communicating well in advance and working with stakeholders and visitors to let them know and work through any impacts. But that again is going to extend the life of the building and really improve experiences while we're waiting on these longer term plans and funding opportunities. And then the Fund Our Future team is looking for additional opportunity for additional engagement in the fall to continue conversations with a broader subset of community around what the city might move forward with in terms of that longer term funding strategy. So that is the conclusion, but I am here. We had plenty of time set aside to happy to answer any questions that you might have, or Yvonne that you might have. Thank you for your time.
When do you think the final report will be?
So it's probably going to be late June or early July would be my guess. Yeah, we got a lot of detail pulled together. Yeah.
I had a question or two about engagement, because you talked about how engagement was solicited. Was it seemed to me to be focused primarily on users or information from users. did we also seek out input from other potential users, for example, or people from BBSD or people like that?
Thank you, sure. So BVSD has definitely been a partner in this project, and they have contributed to the development of an aspect of this needs assessment has been to identify what is their aquatics demand, so that we can understand to what extent do our rec centers actually meet that demand or not. Some of those micro engagements I mentioned earlier are, for example, our community connectors program. We met with folks who live next to North or but may not go as often because it is too busy. So we did make an effort through the process to actually reach these underrepresented populations, whether or not they do or don't go. To get to sort of what you're speaking to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, that input would be important to maybe increase usage or, address some maybe unmet needs in that population.
Yvonne has her hand up.
Thank you. Thank you for that update. That was very helpful. Appreciate that very much. I'm one of the newer board members, so I really appreciate that. I have 3 questions and I can ask them and pause or ask them all at once, however you want to do that. Do you want me to just ask one question or all 3?
You can ask all 3, Yvonne. I'll take some notes. Yeah.
Okay. The first question I had was on the Fund Our Future. Is that something that we as board members are asked to participate in, or just as individual citizens of Boulder? That was the first question, because I would be very interested in participating. The second question was if you could please elaborate more on what's going on at the South Boulder Rec Center, in case I'm asked by any, I live in Table Mesa, and if there are any South Boulder community members asking me about sort of what is happening, what the scope of work is going to be. And then the third question I had was more around what I love about East is that you co-located or we as a community co-located aging wellness, the wellness center. And I'm wondering on the South Boulder Center, whether has there been any discussion with Perkins and Will around co-locating and sharing services that other county and city government agencies need? I'm thinking of, like, is there a need to share more aging type services, but in the South location, or climate programs or sustainability programs that could be hosted there? Again, we're hopefully sharing government funds. If they need a place to do these things, could they occur at the South Boulder Rec Center, as we're thinking about that? I'm also thinking about the library across Table Mesa is, pretty old. I don't know if they're considering upgrading or renovating, but again, co-locating services and facilities. So we're sharing resources from various government agencies, local government agencies, to maximize and optimize and make that the most powerful hub that's going to mean the most for the most people in the community. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. I will take 2 of them and then pass one of them off to Megan to describe more of what the maintenance at South will look like. So I'll start actually with your last question, Yvonne, about the possible co-location of services. So we are, because we're partnering with the Facilities and Fleet Department on this assessment, they also manage a much broader portfolio of city facilities. And so they have elevated the similar building condition needs in that broader portfolio. And we've also been partnering with Housing and Human Services. And so there has been discussion about the value of co-location and whether there is an opportunity or need to do so in either North or South Boulder. But because this project didn't go into site specifics or site feasibility, we don't expect to have a clear recommendation or decision on that because it's a separate effort that the Housing and Human Services Department needs to do to really understand their demand, similar to how we identified our recreation demand. But we do expect and hope that those threads come together as we continue these conversations and move them forward. Is there anything you would want to add, Ally, to that?
No, only just that, again, and I think you mentioned it earlier, is that of course we're talking to the school district and that is one of the intergovernmental entities. And I do think there are other potentials, but until we figure out our path forward internally, it's hard to open the doors externally.
Yeah. And then as it relates to the Fund Our Future, again, I'll start the answer, and Ally, you may have something else to add in terms of what CRAB's role is. I can say that the team running that, honestly, are experts in engagement and have been working with a project around the Center for, I think it's called the Center for Innovative Democracy, and they're really trying to design a very fair process to get a cross-section of input so that they really understand where voters are. And do that in a way that's transparent and open and engagement with City Council. The mechanics or the details of what that process will look like are still unknown to me, as it's a separate project. And I think a lot of those opportunities will emerge in the fall, in addition to this Community Council Forum in June. But I think there'll be a lot more opportunities in the fall to more fully engage, whether that's as an individual or through community. Anything else, Ally? No.
Thinking back through the questions.
Yeah. And then
The last.
Oh, Sal, thank you.
maintenance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are we ready for Sal?
I think so.
Great,
Yeah.
so there was a request for bids submitted for repair work at the South Boulder Rec Center. That work included, and you'll have to forgive me if you want a detail of everything that was in there, I'd have to look it up and send it to you all after the fact. But it did include a replastering of the pool, an install of some really big fans in the aquatics area to help air circulation, repairs to the HVAC in the gym, and then a full actual paint of the pool area at the South Boulder Rec Center. If you've been there recently, you've seen that's in need. And so those are the things that are called to the top of my head. I know that we've identified a time frame over this summer that is ideal for that work to happen in the pool area, because it could lead to a bit of an extended closure of the pool, because you need to take water out of the pool, build scaffolding to install fans, to paint the whole area. And then ultimately you do the replastering right before you refill, to ensure that that plaster sets correctly. And so we've given them a window of when that would be least impactful for the aquatics area to potentially close for all those repairs. So that the outdoor pools and all the other facility pools could be open. We would intend to keep the rest of that building operational while the pool is undergoing the extensive repair work.
Any other questions?
I guess I have one. Just in light of what Clarissa sent out to us, which we're going to see, and maybe a premature in my question. The Fund Our Future, I'm thinking of like the aquatic center in comparison to the tennis facilities that they're building in East, and the revenue generation potential from CU or other places. Has that been looked into at all for aquatics? I mean, I hear all the time a huge demand for swimming.
When you say, can you be a little more clear? Has that been looked into? What?
Just have a community piece of it, and then also more of an enterprise piece of it to recapture some of the costs and
Sure.
expenses.
There is an aquatics coalition in town that we're talking with closely, and they're reviewing a lot of case studies. We've yet to find one that is profit generating, right? A lot of aquatic facilities bring in revenue through fees. None of them that we found are enterprises. And if the ones that get close are very exclusive and private, not open to the community. That being said, we're well aware, this community said for a very long time, we sure love to swim, would like to swim more. And so we continue to have conversations with the Aquatics Coalition, with others, with the school district to figure out how we might meet this community's desire to swim more.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I have a couple questions. As far as the breakdown between sustainability and financial stewardship, if, for example, let's just say we're gonna spend $10 million to retrofit North Boulder Rec, how much of that percentage-wise usually would be put towards environmental sustainability?
That is a fine question that we are, it is a moving target, if I can be honest. So as we're looking at east, costs are escalating as we speak right now in such a way that it's a little hard to predict, but we do recognize that these facilities were built so long ago that it's very hard to adapt an existing building to current energy codes. We are learning quite a bit about just how difficult that is. And so the percentage is, I can't give you a number, but it's a substantial portion of the budget.
I was just kind of curious as to how those energy codes that Boulder has implemented are impacting things like this. I think that that's just something to take into consideration as we move forward
Significantly.
with-
Yeah.
Significant, yeah.
Just like they impact all building costs in Boulder, right? I mean, building in Boulder is expensive. We have really high expectations for thoughtful design, for setbacks. We have a height limit. We have, you know, there are. Boulder is what it is because of decades of thoughtful planning and development of the built environment. And that doesn't come for free. Otherwise, everybody would do it.
Okay, and then scary question. What happens if we put together all this stuff and Fund Our Future comes onto the 26th ballot and does not pass? What do we do?
Hard choices, really hard choices with our community about what is most important. And, you know, we have already talked about, and part of what deepened this conversation around the future of recreation centers was the reality that we have been duct taping and band-aided the South Boulder Recreation Center together. And, you know, our asset management strategy was kind of cross your fingers and hope it doesn't fail, because if it does, we're going to really have to prioritize more than anything pool time. Gyms, there's substitutability in the community, right? Every elementary school, middle school, and high school has some level of a gym. But to lose a pool, and especially October through March, would be a real impact on our community. And so you'd have to start making choices. You also would look at other things, right? And I'll speak specifically to schools. I grew up in Minnesota, and in Minnesota, the ice is available from 6 a.m. to midnight because ice is really expensive and there's not a lot of it. And so you optimize the crap out of the schedule. Right now, that's not a very professional way to say that. I'm sorry.
We got it though.
I know, but right now, you know, there is a lot of demand on our pools. They're fairly open after 8 o'clock at night.
They're like almost 80% open after 7 o'clock at night.
So is there a plan B or a plan C if Fund Our Future doesn't pass?
It's to prioritize and reduce service levels. I mean, we've said this even without Fund Our Future since 2022. So the costs of providing services in Boulder have not kept pace with the revenues. You've seen we've increased fees last fall. This board really struggled with the fee increases we had to pass to balance our budget. And we already are, if Fund Our Future passes, yes, glory days are ahead. If it does not, we are doing everything we can, to Rob's question around, so, you know, how can we generate revenue here in the department? We're leaning in hard on that at the golf course. We're doing work this year to get that way at the Boulder Reservoir. A lot of the services we provide, and I think it's next month or some month soon, you're going to see a beautiful presentation from Megan that talks about the extensive community benefit that we provide at the rec centers means that I think about 40% of our users are not paying the full cost of the service. And that's the role of public parks and recreation, right? To make sure that you're removing physical barriers, that you're providing a place for young people and older adults and people with disabilities and people with low income, but that comes at a cost. So that was a really long explanation, but I just, if there's not additional funding, we will be reducing services.
Okay. And then my last question is, will the report that comes out this summer indicate whether we think, like, I think that we know that South Boulder Rec is a total tear down rebuild. Will it indicate East Boulder and North Boulder, we're talking about just maintaining and maybe adding on a running track or something like that? Will the report indicate what we think we'll need to do as far as additions or tear downs and all?
Oh, sure. Sorry, yes, at a very high level, absolutely. Yeah, we're trying to identify, again, how, like, of all the needs, where can we fit things in? Where might they work best? But again, it's in the absence of site feasibility. We're really, you know, for example, those just as Jenny, you and others may know, the current location of the South Boulder Rec facility is in a very high water table location, which is what's causing the issues in the pool. In some ways, the pool is lower than the lake itself. And so there are things like that that will constrain what we can actually do once we get into that additional feasibility, which it's a chicken and egg in terms of.
Is it fair to say, Darren, we've penciled in a park plan for Hollow Plats to complement the work so we can have a better understanding?
Yeah, we'd want to look at it holistically because we might need to shift a few things around in order to make it work. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Yvonne had another question.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't see who was asking this question about what the Plan B was, and I hear Ally saying, you know, we reduce services. Are we actively working on creating what that Plan B, those reduced services are? I don't want to scare anybody or, you know, the public or anything, but do we already know, generally speaking, you know, what that, you know, a ranking of which services are going to go away first or anything like that?
We have not formally done that work.
And then this is something I probably should know, but is the Funder Futures Initiative, is that Parks and Rec only, or it's a number of different services? Can you broadly tell us what else is included in that, or no?
Everything, it's citywide. So it is the intent, actually, I'm gonna have Jackson answer that question because he's been one of the core team members working to.
Yeah, it's citywide. Every department is being asked to submit what's unfunded on both the capital side as well as the operating budget. A preliminary list was shared with City Council back in April. That was included in your packet, and that has a list of everything from advanced life support for the fire department, new software for the courts department, additional police officers, the rec centers. So it is all encompassing across city services.
Is there a number yet assigned to this? A total number?
That is due on Friday.
All right.
I think next month we will probably have some information that we can share, at least at the department level.
Curious what that total number of underfunded or unfunded across the departments looks like. All right, any other questions on the future of our rec centers? Thank you guys so much. That was a wonderful presentation. It was really all encompassing. I really appreciate all the hard work on that. We look forward to hearing more about it as we go forward.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I'll just note we penciled bringing that needs assessment to you all in July. And so I do appreciate you coming, Darren, to give that process overview. We'll be able to dive right into that conversation. So thanks, Darren.
Thank you. And next we have budget.
Yep.
It's summer, wonderful time of the year. Now handouts. It's time to pay some lights.
Like Stacy might start singing.
Yeah. No, no one wants to do that.
All right, I'm Jackson Height, Business Services Manager. Stacey will be leading off the presentation, and then we have Mark covering CIP. I know we sent you the presentation a few hours ago. There's no expectation that you reviewed it. We will talk through everything. It got a little bit longer than we expected, but I still think we can fly through this in the hour that we have allocated. So, I'm going to turn it over to Stacey to start off.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with everyone tonight. Stacey Hopkins, Senior Budget Analyst for the department. This first slide right here is just really our budget strategy goals with the PREB. We showed this to you last month. This is just really just a reminder. We're looking for your input in the 2026 budget development, and it also goes over what your role in the development would be. So it's really kind of a reminder slide there. Tonight, we are going to take a look at our timeline. We are going to give you a budget development update. We are going to take a little bit of a dive into our fund financials, which is what this handout is, just kind of go over how to read those, what information is included and such, just because we do have a lot of new board members so that everyone becomes familiar. Fund financials is just basically our financial statement. We will be looking at the fee policy introduction, the long-term financial strategy, and then also taking your second touch on the capital investment program. So this slide does give us our timeline of the next few months. So we are obviously at the May meeting tonight, and we will be with you over the next several months to kind of walk through and give more information as the budget is further developed throughout the summer months, and then coming back with you through basically August through the fall to make sure that the PREB is well informed of budget decisions and final appropriation from council. So budget development steps, did share this with you in our April meeting, but this is basically the steps that we take when we are putting together a budget proposal. Base budget increases have been completed. We are in the process this week of doing all of our realignments within the department, and realignments is basically those changes in the budgets that result in a budget neutral or net zero change, right? It's really where we are taking a look at our budgets and we're directing funding where it's going to have the greatest impact or areas that it may have the greatest need. So completing that exercise this week. From there, we will start to work on our enhancements. I will share a list of some of the enhancements the department has identified that we will be moving forward and putting into the budget. Mark will touch on the capital investment program, and then by the end of June, we will have that department budget and we'll bring back some numbers to share with you at that point. So because everything is pretty much preliminary, we will share base cost on the fund financials that have already been submitted. And then next month, we'll come back with some more fund financials that was submitted with our enhancements. Questions so far? All right, so on your fund financial, which is your handout, you do have 3 fund financials for the department. We'll be taking a look at each of them. The first is the 0.25 cent sales tax fund. The second will be our permanent parks and recreation fund. And then the third fund financial is the recreation activity fund, or the RAF. But just before we take a dive into these, just I'm not sure how many people are familiar or had gone on the city's website to look at fund financials in the past, but just some key information as we're reading. They do provide the prior year's actuals, so you will see where we do have 2024 actuals in that first column. It will provide you the approved or adopted budget for 2025. The revised budget would be anything that had carryover or for projects that weren't completed. This is mainly due to capital improvement carryover for multi-year projects. We are building out the 2026 projected, but then do our budget out, fund financial out into the out years through 2031, excuse me. The numbers there are basically, we use inflation for our uses, and then we do calculate out to and project what we think our revenue projections are going to be. For the 0.25 cent sales tax fund, those are revenue projections for sales and use tax. We did flag that as one of the concerns, that it was revised down from CU's work that they had done with the city and our central budget team here in getting a good projection there. So you will see that this fund financial does have that numbers in it. And all of our sources basically are standardized across the city. So you will see that they are just in general broad categories. So you're not going to see, you know, a specific type of revenue, right? It's going to be more at that categorization level. Below our sources of funds, we do have uses of funds, which is categorized by budget program area. This could be very specific to all the departments across the city. For our department, we do have 8 program areas, including our capital investment program. And then kind of down towards the bottom, we will see ending fund balance before reserves. This is basically the remaining balance in the fund after the costs have been subtracted from the revenues. Then we have our reserves. We do maintain an operating reserve, which is a guideline from central budget and within the city. Our operating reserve is at 16.7%. And then you will see too that we do have a sick vacation reserve that is based on basically a 3-year average of usage. So we do put that in. Our reserves are basically not planned to be spent within the current budget year. We hold on to those. And then you have at the end, what is your ending fund balance after reserve? So when we look at or talk about fund health or being balanced in out years, really we are looking at this bottom line number. Questions on just the kind of layout and the content?
I do have a question about the 16.7% for operating reserve. Is that something the city requires?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And I will just elaborate on that. That's recommended best practice from GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association. Basically, it's 2 months of carrying costs if we were to experience an emergency. We do think it's best practice for most funds. You will see certain enterprise funds are higher. Utilities are typically in 40 to 60% range. It is something that we've always questioned for a recreation activity fund. Just user fees contributing to reserves in a rainy day. We could very easily turn off programs a lot quicker on the recreation side.
Thank you.
The other thing I'll just point out because the 0.25 has such mixed uses, we subtract out any CIP capital projects before we calculate that reserve level, because every project carries its own unique contingency to the budget. So we don't include that number when we calculate the 16.7.
Okay, so looking at our 0.25 cent sales tax fund, this does have our base cost increases built into the 2026 projected. This does give us the budget that we'll build upon with our enhancements. So just as a reminder, we had gone over base cost increases with you prior, and those basically are cost driver increases. So we're talking about inflation, contractual, or any city guidelines, which would be energy, fleet, or technology. So those are all reflective in these numbers. And then from here, next step would be to put in the enhancements. So as we do look through this, a fund financial to the bottom, we do have an ending fund balance after reserves of about 7.3 million. We will be programming in about 400,000 or 2.4 million over the next 3 years is what we're projecting out for the next step in our process for some enhancements here. But the fund is healthy, and when we look at 2031, we do have an ending fund balance of $3.6 million, and capital has been basically carried over from what we had costed out last year. So that is a stable number right now, and that's another area that we'll be looking at too. That may fluctuate a little bit.
The beginning fund balance that decreases because of carryover from capital projects?
Your beginning fund balance will basically decrease based on what your spend is. So if you look at your 2024 actuals column and you go down to ending fund balance before reserves, you'll see that's at the 10.694.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now becomes your beginning fund balance. But then as you spend down.
Got it, okay.
Right, so if you are spending more than your sources of revenue, or if you have higher sources of revenue and less expense, that number will change year over year to become your new beginning fund balance.
And I think there's two reasons that you see such a large beginning fund balance. The first is for the last 3 years, our revenues have done much better in the 0.25 than initially budgeted. So that revenue comes in and then is available to spend in later years. And then the second part of it is just the cost of delay with our planning projects and going through more thoughtful processes. We used to think that a CIP project would be 10 to 12 months. We know that that's not the case, that we are trying to do better with our cash flow management, that we aren't budgeting all of the budget in year one. We're spreading that out over a 2 or 3 year project to account for basically cash flow over the course of the CIP project.
And for 2025, we do see the adopted was, does increase up with that carryover. And that was for the capital improvement.
But then specifically, the sources of funds are why is there such a, are these all blank because you just don't know? You don't project out what you don't know.
So what we'll do is we will take a look at where we ended for our 2024 actuals. This is just the base cost. So where you see other revenues came in at 112, and right now we have about a projection base budget of 67. That is for revenue at Delmont City Park. So we will take a look at the last 3 actuals and basically put in an enhancement, right, and probably bring that number up based on actuals. We, as a department, do not put in the budget any grant revenues. We do use the ATB, or adjustment to base process, twice a year to record that into our budget once those grant are secured and we know what the funding is. So that is not budgeted for. And then also your leases, rents, and royalties fall into that same category. If we do have, any additional funding coming in, we do use the ATB process for that.
And what are charges for services?
Charges for services would be anything for fees. So for the 0.25 cents sales tax fund, this basically encompasses a lot of mitigation fees for forestry. So if there is damage done to the trees and people are paying fines and such, that's what a lot of that revenue accounts for. And again, because that is pretty much unknown, that is not something that we've historically put into the budget, but it's something we're talking about internally. Again, looking back at those historic actuals, and does it make sense to start putting something more into the baseline for this fund?
Something I'll note, and it's a little thing, but typically it's practice not to include like 3 grants or those unimposed fees. And I've asked this question before. There's a correlating expense in revenue with each of those that they wash out. The minute you add it into your projected expense, it adds more 16%. Basically, every dollar we plan to spend costs us $1.16. And so for some of these things that are best practice, it actually saves us money. And it's not that, and the number varies so much that, one, it's best practice, but it also benefits us not to program in the spending of the revenue.
Thank you.
By a little bit. Any more questions on the 0.25 cent sales tax fund before we move to permanent parks? Okay, permanent parks and recreation fund. This is where we do fund a lot of our capital improvement program and then the operational expenses that pertain to the work that Mark's team does. So the fund financial is basically set up exactly the same way. This main source of fund is property tax for this. And based on projections that we did receive last month, those have been all updated into the fund to get that base cost increase and such, and other revenues, leases, rents, royalties, same thought process. Those will get put in through any adjustment for base. As we look to 2026 projected, we do have an ending fund balance of 5.8 million. And then as we look to the out years, we do have an ending fund balance of over 2 million. For this fund, we will be looking to program in-through enhancements, about 200,000 per year, about 1.2 million over the 6 years. And that will really be more to support those capital projects in nature. So this one is pretty straightforward and a little easy
Is
to
this
read.
the fund that is the subject of the realm tax?
I was just gonna add that. I want to make 2 notes. One, this fund is currently dedicated to either buying land, of which we're not in acquisition mode and haven't been since 1995, or permanent improvement. So you can't use this for anything related to operations of parkland. And so there is a proposal to the, it started first at the Council Financial Strategy Committee and now has advanced to the full council. It's part of the polling now. Council will follow up on it at their June 26th meeting, but there's 2 proposals on the table. One is to expand the pie so that it's can benefit the entire public realm, not just Parks and Recreation, and that the pie is bigger. So it currently is 0.9 mils and it would go to 3 mils.
And this is also the fund that we will be looking for approval from
Right,
you all
the
on.
board has to approve
Yes.
this. one. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
The board has to approve
By charter expenditures from the Perm Parks and Recreation Fund.
expenditures. Okay,
Yep.
so when we get into the budget for 2026, this is the only fund that needs.
Correct. Yes. Yep. And so that will be when Mark shows you the CIP in a little bit. Some of this fund is the staffing for the planning team. And then other is the actual capital projects. And you can see that there's just the function of planning and our construction team is about 1.7 million. And then there's an additional money on that CIP line.
Can you, the public realm is going to increase the mills, but not take away from our fund, right? I mean, so if they're increasing from 0.9 to 3 mils for the public realm tax, so they're increasing the pie. So they're gonna be using those mills on things other than Parks and Recreation.
It'd be a much more broad definition of use.
Okay, so is that a way to undedicate? I just don't want to get caught in losing money from per park. So if they undedicate parks money, is that a good or a bad thing?
My personal, well, I'll let Jackson go first.
I'd say both. I think it's very good in the fact that we have a very compelling story. Our unfunded list is incredibly long, and there's a lot of work to be done. It is a gamble that it's no longer dedicated to Parks and Recreation, but I think the benefit is it's showing we're a team player and putting the funding towards the highest and best use in any given year. It could be that we get all $12 million hypothetically one year, and the next year it's split 50-50 with another department. I think that it's really just focusing on the greatest good for the city as a whole.
And sometimes it would be no money.
I don't get the sense that there would ever be no money. I think that the 0.9 mils that we currently have is kind of the bottom line threshold that Parks and Recreation would be guaranteed each year.
I don't think there's any guarantee. I mean, here's what I'll offer. Just so I've worked with the city for 22 years, and for all 22 years of them, it's been problematic and constraining the amount and quantity of dedicated funds we have. It is higher than other cities. It limits policymakers' ability in the pandemic. When the recession of 2008, it makes it really hard to prioritize citywide. The hope is that by making the pie bigger and broader, that there's more opportunity to address unmet needs across the system. And there are no guarantees. The one that I say is a guarantee is that this community values Parks and Recreation more than almost any other I know of in the country. And so I don't see it as a defunding of Parks and Recreation, but there's no guarantees.
Can you tell us what other funds are dedicated roughly, like?
There's a total of 40 funds in the city. There's dedicated for open space. Lotteries quasi-dedicated towards whatever the lottery board says. We have the 0.25 cent sales tax. There's the art and culture tax.
Transportation
Transportation tax.
So this would be the only one they're looking to undedicate?
It's for now, yes.
Okay.
I think, I mean, if you look at the out years in the planning as taxes come up for renewal, I do think it's long-term plan that you would continue this conversation.
Okay.
Part of the long-term financial strategy is to undedicate a lot of the dedicated funding across the city, just because it does provide greater flexibility to support highest and best use.
Okay. And then this is a totally, I don't know if this would technically be budget related, but where I grew up, we had a park district. It was the Palatine Park District.
Yep.
Would that be a conversation in the long-term financial strategy that we would talk about? A district like the library district or the downtown district?
Boulder considers itself a full service city and Parks and Recreation is a key part of that. It's not a conversation I've heard brought up in our community. There are park districts in Colorado and they've evolved and come about for a lot of different reasons, but I know our city takes pride in being a full service city, which means we provide parks and recreation.
Thank you.
So doesn't the flexibility make it difficult to budget, Bill?
Yes and no.
Could I answer that?
Before it.
Jackson spoke about like 2-3 year projects. We see like projects 2 to 3 years, especially nowadays with more complex needs. And a good example at the minute is our CIP can be around about 4 to 5 million. The park renovation project's around about 8 or 9 million now, because costs have gone up from $100 5 years ago to $180 today for the same materials. So having that sort of increased pot, larger pot, means we could be like, hey, we actually need to fully renovate the park as opposed to value engineer it. So as we grow the pot, we can sort of plan ahead, as Jackson pointed out, over multiple years, ask the city, and hopefully be seen as a priority need when we do that. So it means we can fully renovate parks as opposed to, at the moment, frankly, with a dedicated fund value engineer and do half of the park. So it's an interesting way to think about how that new and dedicated fund could really help us.
But Mike, your question was, does broader funding mean less? Did you say predictability? What was the word you used?
More flexibility, does that mean less predictability?
Oh.
Because I think Jackson talked about, 1 year we could get, 100%, the next year we could get 50% or even 0, or, back to the 0.9 mils.
I actually view it being a challenge for us having 5 different funding sources that we rely on each year. It means that you're balancing 5 different budgets, different revenues, different expenses, different allowable expenses. We are sitting here debating, where does this person spend their time? Is it really an allowable use? Whereas if there's more flexible funding, it would be broader. I will say generally the city as a whole has 50 to 60% of their budget going towards personnel and supplies and materials, that's not going to really change substantially year over year. Having a singular pot of money to allocate funds for, you still have the exact same funding sources. It's just in a consolidated pot that everyone has their hands in. But I think on one hand, it would make our lives so much easier. You don't need all 3 sheets of paper here and the 2 others that exist elsewhere.
Thank you.
And at the end of the day, council will decide where that money is. And it looks like this is a average of $5 million. So if we were to have it reallocated, that would be what the loss would be roughly based on your projections.
I don't think it would be a loss. It would be that this fund would grow 3 times in size. So there would be $15 million a year.
Instead of 5.
Correct.
Okay.
But that would be split across all the public realm needs.
Jackson, what was the percentage parks received from the recent CCRS tax? Was that around about 50%?
Yeah.
In terms of
how much?
50% from the CCRS tax in 2021. If you factor in the East Civic area and Pearl Street, we received about 50% of the overall budget.
It's a nice example of how the city prioritized park needs through a general tax.
And I think when you zoom out, our portion of the overall city budget is actually only 6%. So I know that we like to think that we have a lot going on, and we do, but at the end of the day, we do share the resources with so many other departments.
You guys are really good team players, for sure.
Yes.
I don't think, I mean, I'll build on what Jackson said. It's not just about being a team player. It's that we all get financial guidance from the central finance office, from GFOA and professional institutions. And the reality is that dedicated taxes are pretty limiting for communities. And when we look at durable funding and ongoing funding, dedicated taxes are problematic. And this one, and if you look at the timing and the needs, it makes sense. It's really restrictive.
I think when we haven't really acquired new parkland since 1995, that was 30 years ago, and that is still one of the key sources we can use this fund for.
Parkland, did you say?
Yep, acquiring parkland.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions about this fund before we move on?
Curious why the property tax for the projected for 2027 seems to go down a little bit.
Great question. There's legislation approved last year at the state level that does decrease. I'm not even going to pretend I know property tax bills, but basically there was a trade-off where the amount that municipalities receive decreases by about 5%. And then you see that assessment years is every 2 years. So that's why you have the exact same dollar amount in 28, 29, and then 30 and 31. Can give you a much longer.
No, that's fine. That makes sense.
I don't get it.
Right, moving to the last fund we're going to review this evening is the Recreation Activity Fund. Just as a reminder to the crowd, this is more of the semi-quasi enterprise fund. We do treat this fund a little bit more like a business and do expect things to be balanced at the end of the day. This does have a lot more categories for your sources of funds because this is what is basically supporting all of our recreation services across the department. So the golf course, the reservoir, all of the activities within the recreation centers, all the recreation services, sports programs, gymnastics and such. So we do have a few more categories in here. And then you will also see that we do receive a subsidy from the general fund as a line item in here that has remained pretty much flat for the past 10 years. This does support our age-based discounting and then a lot of our community benefit programming through expanding YSI. This fund also has been taking in a transfer from the 0.25 cent sales tax fund to support community benefit programming as well. You can see where that does kind of decrease and drop off. There's two line items, an ongoing and then a conditional. The conditional is programmed to kind of stop on 2029 for that last year there. And the reason behind that is we do want this fund to be very self-sustaining in the out years. However, did need that conditional transfer to come over to support those community benefit programming within the RAF. But we know that does have trade-offs as, you know, and taking away from needs within the 0.25. So just something that the department is working on with the long-term financial strategy. The last line item up under sources is implementation of fee policy and business plans. This is really a placeholder that we put in the budget, knowing that we're going to be doing work in out years. This accounts for any of fee updates, fee increases that we may have. It does any fundraising for the department. We do have a placeholder dollar in for that. And then also have used this in the past just for some of those reoccurring grants that we do typically get year over year as a department with our Recreity through the Health Equity Fund that supports Recreity at the rec centers. And then also YSI, and then just a few other grants that come in year over year. So that is why that is in yellow. The next time you see that our 2026 $750,000, we've been spending the last couple of weeks just taking a look at our 2024 actuals for revenue within this fund and basically realigning all of that up into those above categories, charges for services, lease, rents, royalties, other revenues, to where we did actually come in 2024 and in which program area. So the department is pretty strategic in actually taking a look at all the single line items that make up their short five with all the services that we offer and putting that funding up there. So on the next one, we will not see the 750, it will actually be above that. Questions on our sources at all?
What is transfers and, I'm sorry if you said it already, what is transfer and transportation fund?
Yep, this is a small
amount that we have received?
I think it
forever?
goes back to 1996, something about the remodel of the North Boulder Rec Center. Transportation demand management, basically, this was a subsidy in. It is fixed at $13,000 as an ongoing amount, and
Just keeps coming.
Just
Yep.
keeps going.
we've been through 2 financial system updates since then, and the money keeps showing up.
Okay, great.
All right, and then sources, uses of funds, community building and partnerships, and then the rec operations, community building and partnerships is our expand programming and our YSI inclusion programming, and then recreation operations basically encompasses everything else. You will see as we look through our expenses for the out years, we have called out that we have projected out the regional wage minimum increase impact from 2027 to 2031, knowing that that increase is going to go a little bit higher than our typical 3% for our inflationary. So that is built into our budget. As we do go down and look at the bottom line here, you will see 2026 does end with a fund balance of 3.1 million, but we do go into the negative in 2029 through 2031. Normally, it has been requested, that we do have a balanced fund financial. This fund has not been balanced in the out years, the past 2 years about, that we have been submitting it because we do want our storytelling to be heard, that we are looking at long-term financial sustainability, that our expenses, as you have all heard, are increasing and outpacing our revenues, in that the department will have to look at some, decisions to make sure that we can balance this fund in the out years.
Is the storytelling for like fund our future, or is the storytelling for fee increases?
I think we're aware that we're at the top of the market, that every organization does do minor fee increases on a certain cadence. The fee policy that you approved said that we would revisit fees every 2 years. This really ties into Fund Our Future.
Okay.
The general fund subsidy has remained flat at 1.6 million. We as a department have chosen to fund recreation activities through the 0.25 cent sales tax fund, and that is a choice policy question where we are no longer funding capital at the full amount or land operations at the full amount in order to subsidize recreation for the priority communities identified in the plans, that we would really benefit from additional funding, or we're going to need to reduce levels of service.
So this reflects the value of the Plan B or Plan C that we were talking about.
Correct.
It's more stark in recreation because there's a dollar amount to what you do or don't do. It's much harder in the other funds because you don't see the cost of not fully funding maintenance. You don't see, right? That's a whole separate list to see, okay, we're not doing service A, B, or C, and you don't see the cost of that. But the reality is when you underfund maintenance, there is a cost to that. So you can see it visually here because we're maintaining those services. You don't see it in the same way when it's land-based.
Thank you.
Can I also just connect out to you, Jenny? You asked if it's also, it is about fees. You're going to hear over the next several months about proposed fee increases. We know there are areas where there is some room. So for example, the golf course is in the bottom third of the market. It's been that way intentionally, and it's going to change intentionally because it doesn't make sense any longer for us to be in that spot in the market.
And I think what you'll see when we come back next month is we will identify where we're proposing the revenue adjustments. We'll give you a heads up tonight. The hard part for us is we're putting a placeholder budget in now that when we ask you to approve this budget in July, we think all of the adjustments we make will be able to afford that. We wait until we see actual visitation over the summer months and then come back with a proposed fee schedule. I think that we're in a much better position right now than we were last year. And we heard very clearly from PRAB that they want awareness as far as where the fee increases will be. So that will be called out directly next month.
And then the recreation operations, is this the full cost or is it spread out over multiple funds?
So the recreation operations for the RAP includes the Reservoir is in here, the golf course, all the centers, the outdoor pools, and then recreation services. So gymnastics programs, sports turf, is all in this, and it's just really underneath the one budget program. Is how it's structured now.
Perfect.
Thank you.
The finance term budget
Yeah.
program, right? Recreation in the city's budget, which is 9 billion lines and, $500 million. Recreation operations is one line, which I know makes it hard.
This one here is.
It drives us crazy, so you're not alone.
It's a
if
recent
you wonder
change.
what this is.
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I watched the gentleman from CU give his economic forecast. Is there another forecast that takes in the current administration, the tariffs, and you said 3% CPI is baked into this? Is there another worst case scenario?
That is on the high end, so we have actually taken a little bit higher in the out years than the recommended CPI that was provided. I think it was more at a 2.6 or 2.8. And we just based on what our historical spend have gone with the 3. Now, this is not in there yet for tariffs and such. I don't think really impacts been seen financially, but we do have those adjustments to base to make adjustments if things do increase quicker or differently than we expected.
Rob, I think that the city has historically taken the stance that they go with a mid-ground perspective of not the most conservative, not the most aggressive, and aware of financial policies that are current at the time. So this could very easily change, but right now we're working off of our best guess. That said, I think last Friday, city manager's office and our CFO shared, we are in a fiscally conservative environment. We have no clue what's happening with tariffs, with federal funding for grants for other departments. So we need to continue to be fiscally constrained and just aware of highest and best use of every dollar that we're spending.
Thank you.
And that 3% too is the Denver area, so our local market, it's not. Any questions?
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Always break out so nicely.
Thank you. All right, there are no numbers. These are just some of our 2026 budget enhancements. In June, we will be coming back.
Yeah, I just want to pause and make sure everyone, because I feel like all of these terms and even like there's lots of finance terms that are even newer to us. And I feel like if they're newer to us, then they're really new to you all. So what this is we just take everything we're doing and we cost escalate based on what we know. That's what is in front of you. This is now then, what else do we think needs to be happening? That's what enhancements are.
Yeah, proposals. So that is the next step, and proposals basically will have a change in service level, right? Base cost increases where there's base cost drivers, if we think back to those definitions. The realignments that we're doing this week has that net zero, and the enhancements are things that will change service levels or have a significant change within the department. So we basically do take these and we put them into 2 different categories. One would be an ongoing funding request, and the second category would be one-time funding. So simple terms, ongoing would be, we would need this funding in 2026 and beyond, right? It's something that we are looking to get funded, and then it will be continuing in our budget. So when we do a plan for that, we will put that in the fund financials all the way through the out years. Our one-time funding request would be a 1 year. So this is just funding that we're looking for in 2026, and there's different reasons for that. So we'll kind of go over our ongoing funding requests the department has identified, and then the one-time. We do have this broken down by more of a program area, not a budget program area, but just to get a little bit more granular, and then also by the fund. So for the general fund, we will be putting forward a request for forestry for the commercial tree program. And the commercial tree program was identified in the 2018 Urban Strategic Plan, and this really pertains to funding tree replacement and also tree grates in those commercial areas throughout the city for forestry. When we move to the 0.25 sales tax fund, we are looking at establishing a current replacement value revolving maintenance account to help fund new facilities. So we have brought the Boulder Reservoir building, Flatirons Golf Course building, and Scott Carpenter Pool online since 2020. And it's really in the department's best interest to put basically maintenance funding aside for that on a revolving account to make sure that we are funding and taking care of what we have, which is not currently established right now. And then for business services, we would like to, we'll be putting forward the proposal of a conversion of 1.0 FTE fixed term back to an ongoing standard. So when the department embarked on its CAPRA accreditation, we did create a fixed term position out of business services to focus on that work. And this request is really asking for that fixed term to really go back into a standard FTE.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Just a full-time equivalent employee, so ongoing, as opposed to having it on the 1 year, because we knew that project was going to be ending. Questions on that so far?
So you'll come back with dollar values for those? Is that-
Yes, we do. Yep.
And this is just this is what's coming.
This is the list that's been identified
Okay.
internally, yes.
Thank you.
So this is not realignment, this is asking for more.
This is what we will be taking in our next step. Yep, so in a proposal, so a change.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Budget terms, sounds right. Looking at the Recreation Activity Fund, we will be putting in a request for aquatics. This is for non-standard staffing. And this is really just to sustain levels. So looking at our 2024 actuals, having all of the pools up and functioning, looking at operating hours and even keeping them at the same, we know that we do need an increase of non-standard staffing dollars to keep all the pools at their current operational level. For marketing, looking at that, funding for additional marketing activities, right? We need to generate revenue for the RAF and across our department. So we do need to invest in marketing to earn that extra revenue. For gymnastics, this is really non-standard staffing to support with program growth. Gymnastics is doing tremendous. The program last year finished a little bit over 1.2 million. They're projecting out probably 1.3 million, and a little bit more in the out years. So they do need to have that staffing to provide that programming there. And then we are also looking for within recreation operations and services, establishing an equipment replacement funding. We do put money in the budget now every year for about 130,000 to keep track and redo replacement at our recreation centers. This would be taking this and putting it a little bit more holistically and looking at all of our needs across recreation and establishing one fund that we would just be putting money into and growing and letting people use it differently for needs as they occur. And that would be ongoing funding requests. As we look to our one-time funding request, this is funding that we would only be asking for in 2026. And there's really two reasons for this. Some of these are pilot programs we want to see before we commit to ongoing, do they have an impact, right? Do they change things? So as we look to our 0.25 sales tax, special events, we would like to do some more park activation with increased events. This is one area where funding had been decreased and want to see what that would do for our community. Also, urban rangers do need a new vehicle. So that would just be a one-time funding cost for that. And then within the Recreation Activity Fund, marketing, we would like to propose a one-year fixed term position to drive revenue through focus on sponsorships for the department. For fitness, we are looking to pilot out a one-year fixed term position to really focus on personal training to increase revenue in that area. Really having a consistent person can help build clientele and such. So that would be a pilot program for Expand in Fitness. We're looking at funding for interns to support those programs. And then YSI, we did get a grant in, so it's really just offsetting expenses. So we already have the grant funding committed, so we would just do one time for next year. Pretty much the requests do have projected revenue increases across marketing, gymnastics, fitness, and YSI. So we will be putting in an offsetting revenue proposal.
So who are you asking? Are you asking city council and city manager to adjust these?
So we'll be coming back to you next month with a dollar amount, and then when you approve the budget, that is essentially asking us to take it through the approval process with the city. So it'll go from you to the executive budget team and then to city council.
So if you're asking for additions to the general fund and the 25% sales tax fund, I think I understand those because those are a pot of money that are split between different groups. But the RAF is what it is, right? So how do you get more money out of the recreation activity fund if it's just based on fees?
This is where we're looking at growing programming that has an offsetting revenue. It's through grants, it's through sponsorships.
It's still a budget increase that you would need to approve.
Okay.
So I hear what you're saying, like, who's gonna care? Who would say no?
Well, not who would say no, but how do you get more money out of something that you already know kind of where the, it's like a set dollar.
Because this is still a governmental fund, it does need to go through the approval process. But we are really looking at the business justification process of, does this pay for itself? Who's benefiting the most from it? So.
And this comes from like fees at the golf course.
Fees or specific fees. So if we look at gymnastics, right, we're asking for an increase in non-standard staffing to support growing program levels. So we have a need where people want to take more programming. So we'll look, okay, we can spend $20,000 making this figure up, right, for non-standard staffing, but we have the potential to generate $35,000 in revenue, as opposed to saying, you know what, we're not going to ask for that, and we're just going to keep service levels down. So that's where the proposals really do go into a change in service level too. If we meet that, then we can grow it. The only area on this that was listed that didn't really have that revenue offset was aquatics. And that is really just because of the minimum wage increases and the number of lifeguards that we need to operate safe facilities at the scheduled hours of operation, right? We do need more money based on 2024 actuals. So if that did not happen, then we have to talk about other things. Thank you for explaining. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna go over the fee policy again. I know that you all have seen this before. PRAB had approved the fee policy back in 2023. With this, we then set an annual fee schedule that's approved by what we call the city manager rule. This means it's just not a codified fee that isn't in the BRC, but it still does go through a noticing period. With the fee policy, our focus is really on this graphic on the left, where user fees are paying for activities where individuals benefit, whereas taxes, so the general fund subsidy, is paying where the community benefits. The 22 department plan and the 2014 department plan both said that people with disabilities, youth, seniors, and low-income individuals are who really benefits from that community aspect. So that's where we have continually invested our subsidy that we do receive. With our fee updates, we are really focused on targeted areas. The facility access fees will be evaluating our membership structure. We last updated our membership structure in 2019, going into 2020. 3 months later, recreation shut down completely. So since that time, we have had Scott Carpenter Pool open, as well as the Boulder Reservoir main building open as well, that we really just want to look at this. Megan gave you a little preview of this in your consent agenda tonight, and we will be back next month talking through this a little bit more. Ali already mentioned that the golf course fees are in the bottom third of the market right now, and demand is still through the roof at the golf course, that we really would like to look at fees here. Leaning into the 22 department plan, can we generate additional revenue at the golf course that then subsidizes recreation elsewhere? can it pay for capital enhancements at the golf course? That's really what our goal would be here. And then we have an internal team working on a community access framework that really encompasses programming, rentals, and commercial use. So this is simplifying the process, making it more consistent, and having consistent cost recovery targets across. So you'll hear more about this, but generally the intention would be to update the fees as part of this engagement work that they've already been doing. And then the final area that we'd really like to focus on in 26 is court fees. Last year, there was a court systems plan that was brought to CRAB, and this is really just implementing that, knowing that we have new courts coming online shortly. Any questions on the targeted areas of fee updates?
I'm just curious about the golf course. How much is recaptured right now to cover expenses?
We brought in 2.2 million last year and spent 1.8%
over.
Direct costs is covering everything. What it is not currently funding are the capital improvements and indirect costs such as the beyond that. So everyone who works at the golf course, it's paying 100% of their salaries. But we have a senior manager that it's, you know, a quarter to a third of their job. We have deputy director, we have Jackson and his team. What we want to get to a place is where it's covering all the direct plus indirect plus capital.
And I will say, you know, from what I've heard from my golf friends, it's true that demand is very high. And it's like, oh, difficult to, you know, you have to schedule that way out if you want to be able to.
Every indicator says increased fees.
All right, great questions. So within the fee policy, there is a strategy listed for how we update fees, and I just want to be very transparent about this. We go through the level of community benefit, so that's really who benefits. Is it the individual or is it the community? We look at supply and demand, back to the golf course example. We look at market comparisons. We'll survey all of the golf courses in a 30-mile radius. How do their fees compare? Are we really comparing apples to apples, or is it apples to oranges? Historically, we have set non-resident rates higher than resident rates, just because they aren't paying sales tax or property tax that contribute to the general fund and our other funding sources. Age-based prioritization comes back to the 22 department plan direction, and I think all of this just continues with, there's clear examples, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is the philosophy that goes into any pricing that we do determine. This is an example within the fee policy. We identified 10 different program areas and then cost recovery targets for each. We've identified different examples here if there are questions. I think we've gone over golf enough tonight, so won't go into too much more detail on that. But something like recreation services, we do really offer the full breadth of that, from community to individual benefit. Individual benefit is something that's a specialty fitness class. So we offer a one-on-one for sports fitness as a better name than that, but basically one-on-one with a private instructor. That would be at 100% cost recovery, where something like a aquatics lesson for someone just learning to swim, we would not achieve full cost recovery, just because there's a community benefit for an individual being able to swim. This is, you already have access to this. I'm not going to go through every example, but that really goes over our fee policy process. Are there any questions on it? Cool. Is it on? Okay. Long-term financial strategy, you guys have already alluded to this a whole lot. So we'll skim through it. Basically, the ask for this Friday is to submit a list of all of our unfunded, underfunded items for the Fund Our Future ask. So that's why we will have a better dollar amount next month. You've seen this slide before, but basically anything is yellow. In yellow is underfunded. Anything in red is unfunded. This just goes through and shows that we have a lot of underfunded activities within our parks. The only thing that is truly funded is the baseline urban service plan for Area 3. So that covers parks. Within facilities, you can see once again, we have a lot of underfunded. We do have some funded very well. And then within our programs, we do have more funded here, but there is underfunded as well. So essentially, we're using this previous direction from the 22 department plan, knowing that it had gone through significant community engagement, PRAB and city council. And all of this is feeding into what our list is for areas that we think are underfunded and we want to submit for Fund Our Future. Historically, this list has only included capital projects. They are now asking for operating budget as well. So that's why you'll see some of the things of the subsidy that we're providing included. So just making note of that. Any questions on long-term financial strategy? Okay, it's an exhaustive list. I promise you get a dollar amount next month and you can take bets on what it's going to be. Probably not nice things to say.
No, we'll do it.
All right, capital investment program. Mark and I are going to tag team this real quick. Once again, the ask when we come back to you in July is to approve the 26 budget, which implies the 26 projects. Everything for the out years will just be a placeholder. So that's why we're really just covering the 26 projects with you tonight. We have Primos Park. I think you're all aware of that, just north of us on Broadway. Barker Park Refresh, Evan G. Fine Refresh, East Boulder Community Park Courts, and then the Tom Watson Pickleball. The funding that you see here is a combination over the life cycle of the project. So just I talked about cash flow earlier. Some of these projects do currently have funding. This is the total amount for the project that's being requested over what we call the project life cycle cost.
Can you just expand on that a little bit more? So,
Yeah.
for example, Primos, just because I've been involved with that one since we named it, 4.6 is the total cost of the project.
Mark, I'll let you take that one.
It has a budget around about $80 million. So we're not showing here the contribution from the utilities department in terms of the watershed work that will be done for plain work and also the bridge replacement work and the transport.
Did you say 80 million?
18.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So it's a big.
He said that's gonna be amazing.
Oh, man, we'd have a blast.
Yeah, right. Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Go live there.
18.
All right, 18 million total with between all departments.
Yeah. And that's not the exact number. I'd have Jared Darren's the PM, but I can give you the exact breakdown.
So the 4.62 is what's left to spend?
That's what we've got in CIP from parks to spend on the park amenities in Primos.
Okay.
But we're working really closely with utilities. So as they work on the floodplain, we're making sure that can help like provide access to the creek, etc.
And the 4.2 on a SIP is going to be spent in 2020? I don't remember the length of what we
So
have
the,
left on
yeah,
that one.
the goal with this project would be to finish it by 2027.
By 2027. So that's 4.62 spread over till 2027.
Yeah. So this is just a nice way, as Jackson pointed out, for you to see the total amount.
Okay.
And we've already spent a good amount on the design work, community connector, some of the pop events there. So we don't have that full budget remaining.
So these, I just haven't seen, like, I don't know about Evan G. Fine, we're in the beginning of that one?
So that one is scheduled to begin the design in 2026 and then construction in 2027.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Holy cow.
Here we are. More projects. Boulder Junction Pocket Park is at 30th and Pearl. North Boulder Park, you got a preview from Christoph last month. Pleasant View Sports Fields. Some of the older members have heard about this before, but it really enhances transportation and parking options at the fields there. Bill Bauer, you heard last month, is on hold, just pending the donors finding money.
That's so sad.
And then the Boulder Reservoir Access Road has been on our list since 23 and will be completed before 26. Any questions on this slide?
Is there a place where there's a total SIP number?
That was included as attachment D. We break it down by year and then total amount.
Okay.
Ballpark 60-ish million excluding the rec centers. And then we have park renovation projects. This is just an example of some of the projects underway. The Boulder Reservoir ADA dock, Belmont Park is getting new signage. Barker Refresh you already saw earlier, as well as Evan. Sorry for the duplicates here. And then our CCRS projects are the bigger dollar amounts, and this is what really allows us to achieve the action level funding. through voter-approved additional funding. Civic area, you've heard a lot about. This is a very large pot of money. Pearl Street Mall, this is just a portion of the cost and we'll really just focus on the design work and some enhancements. And then East Boulder Community Center, there's the nexus to what Darren had talked about earlier tonight.
The CCRS projects, is that dependent upon an extension or is that money already committed?
This is already committed. This was the 21 voter approved. Currently, the CCRS has only been cash flowing. There's the ability to bond against this. So when we hit the point of needing 50 million for East construction, the city will bond. And back to the question earlier, Parks and Recreation received about 50% of the overall portion of the CCRS total pot of money. All right, and then Mark's team is working on a lot of different system-wide planning. You heard about the future of recreation centers tonight. There's a similar process being done for parks. There's an updating of the design standards manual, universal access, and then the BPR plan. Basically a update to our 22 department plan. Terrifying already seeing that number. It feels like we just approved this.
What's universal access?
So typically in the past, you were required to do an ADA transition plan about every 10 to 15 years. So rather than just do ADA, which meets a certain level of requirements, universal access takes you one step beyond that in terms of meeting people's community needs for folks experiencing disability.
Thank you.
All right, I'm done with the boring stuff. Mark, it's the fun, pretty pictures now.
You know, it's my happy time of the year, the CIP as well. Yeah, what I'm going to do here is just give you a little bit of background on the asset management program work we're doing. And, you know, you've had a lot of questions on like, why are you prioritizing this? Or where's this, you know, how are we going to manage the funding? So the asset management program is really our deep dive into the assets across the department. But just before I get into that, I wanted to give you a little bit of context with this slide here. As you heard, we're looking at Darren obviously presented on the future of recreation centers, the needs assessment. We're diving slowly into scoping a future parks assessment, and then the two will come together. And you'll see in that circle there, we're looking at things like community recreation facilities. What does it mean in terms of level of service across the system? So that will help inform the future 2029 BPR plan. And hopefully there'll be enough sort of under the hood comprehensive analysis that you will all be able to see that will help make, let's just say, more informed decisions, especially as we're getting into fiscally tight period. So the current asset management program, it's within the planning, design, construction team. Matt Pilger is our senior asset management program manager, and we also work with Sarah Saxon, who is our JIS senior analyst. And they work and really closely with the other service areas. And when you think of asset management, you often think of like a picnic shelter or, you know, etc. But we also cover, for instance, our natural resource department in terms of forestry and natural lands. We also work with our recreation centers, work with our regional parks, and then, you know, more traditionally with park operations. So the asset management program is comprehensive across the department. And some of the things we're rolling out with the program internally is like an overview of the program, frankly, and we're trying to get training going. This is sort of 2 years in the making to get this ready. We'll have internal SharePoint pages, and that's an improvement where everyone can access from their service area all their assets. And we'll have more field resources. One of the issues we've run into in the past is, frankly, collecting data has been tricky in the field, overly complicated. So you'll see that next category there, where we're really looking to create things like I'll talk about in a minute, a report card, dashboards, and all of this currently is internal, and you'll see it's in draft form. The goal is that we can also make that external for you folks, so we can frankly make better decisions and be more informed, more transparency. And then just to show you the breadth of the work, we do cover things like working with Jackson, the long-term financial strategy, and then some of the CIP planning projects. So here you see an example of how we're trying to improve field resources. And one of the things I'm excited about here is you'll see there in green, it says, make it easy for the field staff. We've had many ways to collect data. I forget, Jackson, 20 programs. We're getting down to like one collector app that is sort of universal for assets in the field, that is literally press 5 buttons and you'll be able to know where it's at. What's really great about that is, as I'll show you in a moment, that transforms live, as it were, in the background to update various dashboards, to analyze that information. Where you can see in terms of data collection, we're currently looking at vandalism, irrigation repair. We're actually collecting data on vandalism and graffiti. I know there was a question recently on that from the board, and part of that is trying to figure out what is actually the staff time we're spending on that. Do we need, extra FTE to cover that increase? So we can analyze not just the work we're doing, but the resources we need.
Does it have a name? Like, is it like a database that has a name?
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second, but that's okay, because I'll dive in so you can see it. It's pretty exciting. So this is one of the improvements we're making. It's funny. Next slide, please. I realized I was looking at my presentation and I didn't look at the screen. I was like, oh, that doesn't look right. So this is exciting. This is an example where once we've inventoried all the assets across the system, like courts, picnic shelters, bathrooms, we also can then concentrate them by park. So parks can get a condition report card. So in the past, when we sort of prioritize needs and come to you with the CIP asset management work or the park refreshes, it's been sort of us going through a criterion of prioritization exercises. They're somewhat qualitative. This will get us to a much more quantitative assessment of what is the overall condition of a park or a group of parks or a zone even, so we can get a sense of where the real needs lie in terms of condition.
So will these automatically be generated?
Yes,
There'll be a report card for every part.
yes,
based
and
on
if we
data
go,
collected.
it's very exciting because what we're doing then, okay, I'll dive in, if you go to the next slide, Jackson. We're using the city's using an asset management system, Beehive, and because that's citywide, we'll still input the data into that system for asset management. We're finding though that the Esri GIS, is anyone familiar with GIS? So Esri GIS is the tool we're using whereby it talks to Beehive, but it can also, if we have our inventory in there, produce a series of dashboards or maps that can reflect sort of questions we want to ask. So for instance, what you're seeing here is asset management data collection in a GIS dashboard. And you'll see I've put big red letters draft because people look at one little thing and be like, well, that doesn't look right. Yeah, we're about 70% there. So, but you're seeing each park can have a condition assessment. Also, you could change it and ask the question, well, rather than by park, could we have a report on courts and what the condition assessment is? So the beauty of these dashboards is it goes into that one central database that the person in the field is also able to directly update, and we're able to produce a series of dashboards depending upon the types of questions we ask. And this is a great example of this prototype show condition. Next slide. And then you sort of see under the hood here, this is something we're getting at. We're here, we've done a ton of work, for the court system plan. So for the first time, what you're starting to see is, first off on the left, the assets issued. Then you've got the CRV. What is that total replacement value? And then you see what is the deferred maintenance. The interesting thing about that second and third column is, as a department, we've historically been able to sort of work to cover deferred maintenance, but we've never been able to set aside funding for replacement. And this is a problem across the city we're seeing, where a lot of things are reaching the end of the life cycle. And because costs have gone up, I mentioned from $100 to $100 5 years ago to $180 a day for the same piece of material. We're also realizing that we really need to invest more in that replacement, because as you start to think about courts, most of them will last 25 years. Well, this is where we made the decision to move to post-tension. Courts, the reason being is they will last 50 years and have a much better playing condition. And what's great about that is, even though the cost is higher to do a post-tension court, when you look at the cost savings over 50 years compared to 25 years and the amount of maintenance needed, we calculated to be an overall saving of, I forget the exact number, it was approximately 9 million. And so that's where, if you invest in replacement as opposed to just trying to keep it in good condition, if you're trying to keep it in good condition, it's past its life cycle, that cost of keeping it in good condition just keeps going up and up. And And frankly, the activity experience gets worse. So that was through this analysis, we were able to make that decision and work with the board last year to talk that through. The latest one we'll be looking at is play areas. And you'll see that the bottom line for the total cost to replace our play areas is $41 million. I'll just pause a second because I need a gulp. Now, what's interesting about that is I was just at a national conference last week, Children Nature Network, which focuses on youth outdoors and things like play areas. And it's very clear that the cost of, for instance, prefabricated play area is now at a point where it's between 800,000 to 1.2 million. We currently have a budget per year of about 500,000, and other cities are having a very similar sort of analysis where they're realizing they now can't keep up with the cost of prefabricated play areas because they've deliberately priced themselves out of the market, the manufacturers, for various reasons. So this is an example where, as we analyze this, we're going to look at, for instance, what could we do more in-house through a design build team? Perhaps we can get the cost down by even down from, let's say, 100,000 a play area. If you thought of it just as 100,000 block, down to something like 30 to 40,000. And most of this is like focusing on natural play, which does reduce life cycle. But if you've got slightly reduced life cycle, but a reducing cost of down by 20 to 30%, it's worth it. So that's the sort of analysis under the hood we're doing for the various assets to figure out how, if costs are increasing, we don't just say we need more money. We're trying to figure out how can we better design them and be more efficient as we get into the details of this. And I could talk all night about that because it's exciting work. And then finally, I'll just finish on a quick one. This is an example. We've talked about asset management here. Thank you, Jackson. And that is really, what is the condition of the facilities? What is the cost of replacement? It's very quantitative. This is slightly more qualitative. You've probably heard of Park Score. And that's, there's national organizations to look at what is the quality of park, what score would you give it from the visitor experience, the community experience perspective. So this is something we're looking to launch, Park Q, for older parks. It's in its early nascent stages, but you're starting to think about things like economic vitality, placemaking, community use, equity and accessibility. So you're looking at some of these elements from the community's lens. If you have like a park score along with an asset management score, and you combine them, you get a real sense of the need of that facility, how much the community want it, how much they love it, how useful it is, as opposed to just looking at the condition. So then you can start to make better decisions over time. And next slide. And this is really nascent, but it just gives you a sense of it. Other systems have this now pretty well established, but this can be an internal and external score that the community help provide input on for the quality of our parks across the system. And this was just us testing out what a dashboard might look like for that. So that's kind of the work we're doing. I hope at some point we can come back to you without the draft sign on it, maybe later in the year, and we'll be able to share more details.
That's fascinating.
Wow.
How will you, will you use, will it be like just a running dashboard on the website for people to view, or will you use that information for the strategic plan, or
No, I appreciate
sorry, my
that.
brain is swimming a little bit, but the master plan or the strategic plan, will you put those pieces of information in there? How are you going to?
Yeah, it's pretty easy just to type into Google now and say park scores in the systems, and you'll find within 5 minutes like 20 other examples. Okay. San Francisco does a fantastic job, frankly, on that type of work, including built-in equity work to it, the way they score their parks. So yeah, it'll be used for internal prioritization, decision-making, helping us to support decisions-making as we get to these topics. And then, yes, we'll have to investigate and think through what an external dashboard will look like. But if you look at the examples out there, there's some really good ones to build off.
Great.
The external being public facing.
Yeah. And it's become, and it's very easy now. Like there's some really nice tools where the public can put in, hey, I'd like to see this, or I think we should really think about this. And instead of it being very random, it can aggregate it into categories to help sort it and understand the need. Would you add anything to the Park Q and the?
No, just that I can't wait because it really will be a helpful thing. I mean, you all are starting to hear it. I live right next to Park X, and I really want you to do all the things at Park X. Park B is, has category factors A, B, C, and D that says, no, that's where we need to spend the money. That's all not very transparent or explicit right now. It's just going on what we say. And I'm really eager to make that really clear to the community how we're making choices. I feel like we're doing a really good job based on what I know happens in the black box of the Iris Center. But having the data behind it, having the community input to it is going to be really helpful. It will also tie to the long-term financial strategy because we'll be able to show, hey, play area A is really in a critical area. To do it right would cost X million of dollars, and we could do that, but it means defunding, all these other things.
It's one of those things where I start using it within like a week, wonder how you ever did life without it, you know?
Well, I've wanted it for 10 years, so I know exactly how we're gonna do without it. It's gonna be delightful.
It's gonna be delightful.
And I mean, Mark and his team really are moving it forward in ways that are long overdue.
That's really good.
Great collaboration with Jackson and Steve.
Is there an AI component to this that like takes all the quantitative data and makes it easier for your life?
Yeah, I actually presented on an AI piece last week, and this is a bad pun, but I showed a sketch map of a park and I called it artistic interpretation. No, yeah, we haven't looked into that yet. I would say, well, here's one example. We now have visitation data using Placer AI, which we've never had before for parks. And that's a consultant the city uses that is able to aggregate phone data to give you numbers. So it's almost ubiquitous within systems or consultants now that they use this, but there is a citywide policy to guide us as well as we do it. More to come on that, I think, for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yvonne has a question.
More of a comment, Mark and Ally, your comments. I just want to applaud what you all are doing. It's just blows my mind. It's so amazing. The fact that you are doing this is just a wonderful tool for public relations with the community, especially when we're thinking about capital investments and just the transparency piece. It's just really amazing. And I want to thank you for all your hard work and deep thinking and open-mindedness and exploring really innovative practices. This is just really great stuff. And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
The only thing I would add to that is just I didn't show it tonight, but we're obviously working with the equity mapping we did in the 22 plan to make sure we are folding in a real deep equity analysis to this work to ensure we're also fulfilling that need.
We did have 3 questions for you. I think we've talked about these throughout. But first one is, where would the prioritize funding based on current unmet needs? Second one is focused on the fee increase strategy. And then the third one is, does PROUD desire to develop messaging to include with the budget submittal?
I'll go with number 2. I do, I think, support that. I would just be careful that some of the things, golf and gymnastics specifically are so well attended, and I think partially because it is cost effective, but you don't want to get into a situation where we start to bring up prices and then you start to lose people, and then you still end up at a net zero because you've increased your fees, but you've not made any more money. So, that's just always my concern with fees, although I do, like you said, all signs point to some very specific increases. I trust you 100% on those increases. But in general, increases, all things considered, I know prices are going up, they're just going up for everybody. So fee increases are hard to swallow, especially with Fund Our Future and public realm and, tax extensions and bonds and all the things. So, my thoughts on fee increases stay the same, but I do appreciate how you're managing it. I think it'll be good. Anybody else have a comment on any of those 3?
Well, I'll say, I agree, that there's definitely room to support some fee increases in those areas. You know, I can speak, you know, for myself and my community with pickleball, the fees are particularly low compared to, you know, prices for more like private centers, in the community. So I know that there's definitely some room, where I don't think it would affect usage and demand. But I think what I would love to see, like, as you're doing the analysis, is just, okay, so if we did increase it this much, what would be the potential, like, is
there attrition because of that?
I mean, I don't really, ideally, I think it would be like, what would be the potential scenarios of increases? Like, let's say like low, medium, high. What would be the potential attrition under a low, medium, or high case? And then also, it just, would this make a big impact to the budget, right? So it's like, if we increase the fees from like 250 to 350, is this enough money that it's worth going through all of this effort of increasing the fees? So just sort of what would be the total impact of increasing the court fees? Or should we look at another area? Because if you increase the golf fees, now we're talking about something that's very substantial to the budget versus maybe in some other areas, the impact wouldn't be as great overall.
Yeah, I support the general direction and I like the analysis that was being used. Like, I think it was 10 or 12 points to address or I guess to analyze potential fee increases. I think that was really helpful to see. And I think I'm probably echoing what's already been said, but it would be important to know. So, you know, what does this actually mean in dollars? And then I thought when we're talking about golf, for example, we're looking at potentially increasing the fees where it's a it's a cost plus kind of situation, and then where would that plus be reallocated if we're thinking about taking that as an additional benefit. And then with respect to number one on the recommendations, that's a really hard one to answer based on the information you have. I mean, that's especially as a new board member, it's kind of overwhelming in some sense as to, where would we reallocate funding?
Everywhere.
Yeah, but I mean, if you
It's
look
not
at,
the right answer.
you look at that potential, what the unfunded needs are, and for, I think the top one for the city, the Boulder Rec is at $135 million. How can you even think about that? How are we ever going to address that? So I guess I would need a little bit more information, and I need to spend more time taking a dive on the budget to see about to provide any input on number one. And then on number three, the support, I think it's something that, we gain from attending these meetings is maybe how to better communicate with, for me at least, to better communicate with the public and people I run into. So I'm kind of thinking about generating my own kind of elevator speech with respect to that, especially when we have these potential ballot issues come up. It's going to be really important to have a consistent message and one that effectively communicates the need. So I think we could all work together to generate that and at least make sure that my elevator speech doesn't step in it for you guys.
Well, the messaging, I think, is to council, right? For number three, that's what you're talking about? So they would like to know when we approve the budget,
Right.
what would we say to council?
But I think we also have to, there's another aspect to that too, is if the ballot measures go forward, how can we communicate with the public about it? What do we need to say? And I know there's parameters that, we can't exceed, especially, if we advocate for something in particular. So I think it would be important to know the input from staff as to what we can do or can't do.
I think you can say anything as an individual, right? I mean, you definitely have your own opinions, you just have to say that it's.
Right. Yeah. Speaking for yourself, yeah.
The budget submittal, when that goes in, that won't have anything to do with ballot measures, though, right? That's just the budget
Correct.
plus So we'll wanna discuss probably where we have in conjunction with staff, and I think probably over the next, so that goes in July.
Correct.
So we have June left, okay, so
You have more time if you're messaging, and just to be clear, Jackson included this question because you all proposed
Yes,
this.
right.
This is, okay, I just want to be clear, this isn't us asking you all to make a political statement. You have a little more time in that council doesn't see the budget until a September study session. And so the budget submittal for the executive budget team, that happens in June. Council will talk about the ballot measures in June. And so if you wanted more time to think about that, you would have more time. If you finished it by your August meeting, council would have it for their budget study session. Okay. They would not have your thoughts on, and this is something that may come to you at the June meeting when they talk about ballot measures. They may say, we want to know what the crowd thinks, and you all then would have to come up with talking points or delegate someone that you trust to speak on your behalf to the council.
okay. I mean, I think, like Michael said, it's probably, we just need a little bit more information, some harder numbers to decide what messaging we really wanna send along or potentially respond to if that arises. You know, I'm super curious to know like what that bottom line number is of underfunded projects and unfunded projects. And then that would help also prioritization, I think. I don't know, for me, you know, the rec centers are so important, but it's tough, you know, budget's hard. Cause there's so many important, the parks are super important and we have so many great things coming and Civic Center and Sundance and all the things, so. Yeah, I think after next month, I'll have a better idea of number one, and then number three, we can just kind of do an overview discussion next time, you know, once. So we have a preliminary budget in our packet in June.
Yes, that's
Okay.
the intention.
Okay. So then I would just ask for everybody to take a little time before the meeting to dive into the budget, so we have some opportunities to really discuss, to get into it, ask questions, instead of trying to be educated just right here at the meeting, would be my request to the PRAB for June's meeting.
May I make a note for you, Yvonne? I am so sorry that, you know, I didn't notice until this morning. We are 99% on time arrival with packet by the end of the business day on Wednesday before your meeting. If it's Thursday and you don't have an email from us saying we're late or you don't have the packet, then something's gone wrong, because I can't remember the last time we were late with a packet. It's an expectation of ours that we hold to, so that you all as volunteers have that opportunity later in the week and through the weekend to review the packet. So I just wanted to let you know that's another one of those onboarding things maybe we'll add, but our standard of practice is to have it in your inbox by 5 p.m. on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's great. I was gonna say, I wish I could respond to these questions, but I think I just want to be thoughtful in responding. I need a little bit more time to thoroughly review the packet and to just think through what was discussed today to be able to provide a thoughtful response. But yeah, appreciate that.
Feel free to reach out with us, Yvonne. That is, just to be fair, Yvonne got it this morning and was traveling, and so that's pretty fair to ask for a little more grace.
And this was a really great overview, I think, for everybody to now, once we get those hard numbers and kind of understand what we're looking at. So thank you for putting together a really thoughtful presentation. I think it was very, very helpful for everybody. And, you know, always remember, staff is always willing to answer questions. So as you go through the packet, or if you have any questions when you go home tonight or over the next month, they're super responsive. So always feel free to reach out to staff and ask. Please let me know if that's overstepping or anything.
No, just start with me always, because I can help manage workload for our staff.
I would just add for number 2, I'm sure you have thought of this because you're way smarter than me. As far as the fee increase strategy and attrition, is this going to be rolled out over the years increases, or like what is the percentage of increases year to year? that you're thinking of for each individual potential fee increase?
So we track all of our fee increases. I believe we can go back to 2016 or 2014 at this point. Okay, 2002.
There's a spreadsheet.
We definitely want to go.
It's a
Um,
reminder.
Generally, we like to show you what the dollar amount is, what the percentage increase is. For anything that is community or recreation, we have tried to cap increases at 10% a year or less. Just recognizing that those are really the people we're trying to attract. For the individual benefit programs, we have done over 10% increases. Just recognizing they really are the ones who are benefiting the most, and we could be 30% under market. Obviously, we're not going to do a 30% price increase. We want to phase it in over time. So with any of these, we would indicate, is this a multi-year phase up to get to a targeted number, or is it a one-year adjustment and we'll revisit it in 2 years?
Gotcha, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on to matters from the board? All right, so matters from the board. This portion of the meeting is for members of the board to report on crafting a work plan goal of each member, attending 2 or more parks and recreation related community activities per month, promoting parks and recreation through social media, attending site tours, and supporting the department's partnership initiatives. What items would board members like to report on at this time? I will start with, I did attend the Climate for Classrooms happy hour last week. It's a super great organization if you haven't heard of it. They handle a lot of different educational opportunities for elementary or middle and high school students. They work in conjunction with Play Boulder to do tree plantings, and they have a lot of good programming throughout. They work with BVSD on a lot of stuff. And next semester, they'll have 2 actual classes dedicated to climate education at the high school level. So it sounds something like the CCRS tax. It's like climate resiliency and something or another. But yeah, there'll be electives for students to take to learn more about climate initiatives and the environment. So that was a really good meeting. And then I was out of town for the Play Boulder meeting on Thursday. So I do not have a current report for that, except that we are still recruiting for the board, and placemaking is going. Anything else from anybody on the board at this time?
Fortunately, did not do any work.
It gets harder as the summer goes on, so. I would ask, just Clarissa, if you wouldn't mind, I know that there was something on the schedule that I saw, a date for, in June, I think it was, 6/12, the Fund Our Future. If you wouldn't mind sending out just, if there's any community engagement opportunities for PRAB, if you wouldn't mind just sending us a calendar invite, it might just be really helpful. I know that we've done that in the past. And I love that. Yeah, it's been really helpful for the board to be able to attend some events. So anything you see that's interesting, as long as it's okay with.
I think both of those civic area ones would be great appointment ones, the concerts, open house, the June and July, and then yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
All right, good.
Well, we'll say, I think we all probably spent a lot of time in North Boulder Park, but it is really fun, since our last meeting, that when I'm there with my friends and we're having a picnic, that I can also just be like, oh, this is what the future holds for this park. So, and I think, anyone that I've talked about the designs with, I think their first reaction is always like, oh, they're going to minimize the open space. Are we still going to have this? Are we still going to have that? So I was really impressed, especially with the presentation. So, armed with all of the facts to show that all the existing activities that everyone loves are going to continue, but there's going to be so much more added. And then when people hear that, they're like, oh, okay, there's some exciting things to look forward to. So far, I've been pretty positive, the people that I've talked to about it so far.
It's a great place when there's good weather.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been pretty good lately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even bad weather, skiing.
Right.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah, it's really not.
All right, well, Yvonne's 2 hours ahead, so our next board meeting is June 23rd, same time, I think, same place. Same place, yep, okay. And if there's no further business for the PRAB tonight, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for presentations.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I hate that new board members start in April. Like, and this is the first thing you have to dive into, because it's like Jackson and Stacy do such a great job chunking it out and trying to make it bite size, and it's still like, it's just a lot. And so
Just feel like
thank you.
drinking from the fire hose.
Know that no board member says that they totally got it their first year, right? Like every board member is like, you're too, so much better.
Also push for July 1st fiscal year.
Oh.
I wait for that.
Ugh.
Bye, guys. Bye, everybody. See you soon.
Yvonne.
Make sure you get your hat.
Yeah. I'll leave it for you. I'll just tell you all.
Thank you all. Have a nice night.